Here it says, "We say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen." All right, so sorry about starting late because of the broken link, but now that we are on, let's jump into our study for today. So last week we covered David and Goliath, and we looked at the boldness of David, and we highlighted his motivation for God's glory. We looked at his boldness with respect to being composed in the face of insults, as his brothers were insulting him, and boldness with how he chose to just be himself, how he chose his own stones, used his own weapons, and relied on his past of seeing how God has delivered him out of tough situations. And all this led to the defeat of David and Goliath, of Goliath, and really brings David into the limelight and to the forefront of the scene right now. And what we're going to see in the next couple of chapters, and we're going to focus on, is this three-way relationship that very, very quickly develops with respect to David, Jonathan, and Saul, where there's a beautiful friendship that develops, and kind of clouding over that friendship is the jealousy of Saul, and that jealousy just begins to spiral out of control until it really leads to a lot of damage for David, Jonathan, and everyone involved. And as we kind of look at this, the one thing that I want us to look at and reflect on is with respect to Saul. We see a lot of fear and insecurity in him, which we have seen, so the pattern is consistent, but he takes it to a new level in these coming chapters, because as he fears David more and more, and we'll read that in the verses, he also fears that there's a impending loss associated with David's growth and maturity. And so the question I want everybody to kind of reflect on in your minds is, what is your response to that emotion of fear in the face of loss? Like when you feel there's an impending loss coming, either it's a loss of position, loss of a certain relationship, loss of finances, loss of possessions, or loss of control, right? All these are different sort of losses that we face in life, and we can, we experience fear as a result of these potential losses, right? How does that fear manifest in us, right? Is the question. In Saul, what we see is jealousy and anger and revenge, right? And so as we kind of examine Saul and look at David and Jonathan, I want everybody to be thinking about, like, how do you respond to that sense of fear with respect to an impending loss that is coming up? Okay. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. And let's get started with our first set of verses, and we're going to try and cover Samuel 18, 19, and 20. Because we're starting a little bit late, we may not get all the way through, which is no problem at all. All right, so I'm going to get us going with respect to the development of the relationship between Jonathan and David, right? And so it's Samuel 18, verses 1 through 4. And it says, "Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt." Right? So we see this, very quickly, relationship, this friendship happens between Jonathan and David, and they share a lot of commonality, right? They're both, David's a young boy and Jonathan's older, but Jonathan definitely sees something in David. he shows a lot of um, I guess, courage when he went out to fight David. He's looking at David and how he is, how he just lifted up all the spirits of Israel. So there's a lot to like about David, and this relationship it's so organic, but that's the way friendships are, and that's what makes friendships so special, right? Because they are organic. There's a free element to them where there's no there's no binding contract between friends. It's just a free choice that each friend makes on their own to befriend somebody else, right? We are all free to choose our friends. And so we see this happening between David and Jonathan, and the sense that we get is that this friendship very quickly, because they're just scriptures describing it as the soul of one was knit to the other. And we always see the soul as something that functions on a higher level and a deeper level, right? That it goes beyond the flesh and it goes beyond the physical world that we see, and something deeper is happening. And so that's the picture that we get from this relationship, between the friendship between David and Jonathan. And unfortunately, I think many have tried to inappropriately skew this relationship between David and Jonathan, to kind of suit their own agendas. But when we look at it, we see that it's a deep relationship. And we're going to look at kind of elements of that deep friendship as this unfolds. The other thing, just to quickly point out, is this is such a unique day in David's life. So he started out bringing up bread, then he ended up fighting Goliath. He took Goliath's sword, they won the battle. And then he's before Saul, and Jonathan, finds him, and clearly there's a special connection. And then Jonathan gives him his sword. And so in the matter of a day or 2 days, however this exactly unfolded, David receives two swords, right? Little shepherd boy who uses sling all of a sudden has the sword of Goliath, which is a symbol of victory and valor. And then he also has the sword of Jonathan, which is a unique sword, because it was the prince's sword. Jonathan was the heir to the throne. And so for Jonathan to give him his garments and his armory and his bow and his belt and all these things, it's such an honor, and it speaks to the depth of the relationship. And this relationship quickly unfolds. And what we see is that Saul very quickly gets jealous, right? And if we look at verses 5-9, it says, "So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and behaved wisely. And Saul sent him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened, as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang and danced to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.' Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' So Saul eyed David from that day forward." Right? So we see clearly jealousy coming up in the life of Saul. And this jealousy leads to a bunch of targeted attacks. And we're gonna, summarize these attacks, which really come, in the next 3 chapters. But there's a couple that I want to point out in the rest of chapter 18. But as we're doing this, I think it's probably safe to say that every one of us have been probably on the delivery end of attacks rooted in jealousy, and we've also been on the receiving end of somebody who is attacking us out of jealousy, right? So we've probably played both sides of this, right? And And so I want us to reflect and kind of, if you can, bring to your mind a time where you were the recipient of malicious attacks, of somebody who's just coming out after you. You didn't quite understand why, you didn't feel like you did anything wrong, but you felt like there was something there, something fueling these attacks. And the question is like, how did you respond? Because what we want to see out of David is saying, how did he respond? These attacks were tough. And when we look at chapter 18, kind of qualify the attacks in three different ways, right? There was just a clear, direct attempt by Saul. In what 18 captures is a story of where the distressing spirit comes once again, and Saul is upset by this. David is playing the harp to try and calm him down, and he's just eyeing David the whole time, and he throws a spear trying to pin him to the wall, and he's unable to do it. So it's a very, very direct attempt. And David runs out. He escapes. He's not pinned to the wall, but he escapes, right? And kind of as we move through this narrative, like it seems like there's no clear resolution. There's no reconciliation after this. David kind of brushes it off, goes back to his work as being over the army. Saul sends him out. He's continually victorious in battle. And then there comes an indirect means of attacking David. And this comes as David is continuing to grow in his acceptance by everybody else. Okay. What we see is that Saul tries to humiliate him, and he humiliates him by saying like, David, I want you to have my eldest daughter. And it's a big deal to give your eldest daughter as a king in marriage, right? So he sets David up to marry his eldest daughter, but just before the wedding, Saul like marries her off to somebody else. And so it's a way of trying to humiliate David, right? To get a rise out of him. And yet, like, David doesn't really respond to it. He just kind of like holds back. He sees his place. He's like, yes, I'm a captain over the army, but I'm still like a shepherd boy. I come from from a poor family. I come from a place where, the thought of royalty is the furthest thing from our minds. And so he just kind of sits back. And then the other one is that, after humiliating him with his first daughter, he says, okay, well, I'm going to give you my next one, which is Michelle. And he says, let me try and set him up to fail, because it's better for somebody else, like for David to fall and fail, at the hands of somebody else, than for it to be directly related to me. And so he says, you can have my second daughter, but I need you to go and get 100 foreskins from the Philistines, thinking that, well, if he goes and fights and he's trying to get 100 foreskins, high probability that something bad is going to happen in this battle, right? But David goes, not only does he get 100 foreskins, he gets 200 foreskins, right? And he brings it and he lays it at Saul's feet, which is in lieu of a dowry, because David comes from a poor family. And so to pay the king a dowry for his daughter was just out of his ability. But Saul sets him up and says, oh, forget about the dowry. Just give me the foreskins, hoping that he would die in the process, right? And David doesn't. And David kind of, meets each one of these challenges, and he does it so well, right? And this is where we need to glean this lesson from David, is that while all of us at different points in time are always going to be attacks, that are rooted in jealousy, or somebody is feeling insecure about us, a superior is even feeling insecure about us, and they want to put us down, they'll attack in a couple different ways. They'll attack directly, they can try humiliating us, or they can set us up to fail. And those are the three ways that King Saul was trying to bring David down. But David's response to all of these, all right, the direct attack, indirect, and set up for failure, was he lived with integrity, right? He managed himself with integrity through all of these situations. When the spear was thrown, he didn't attack the king, he just left, right? he ran. He didn't like make a big stink of it, went on to do his duties. When he was embarrassed by Michelle, he didn't by not getting the first daughter, he said it's okay. All right. Second one, he was set up to fail to get 100 foreskins. He worked hard and he exceeded and got 200, right? So in all these situations, he lived with integrity. And we see this being captured in scripture, right? Yeah, this verse, sorry. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. Right? This is a beautiful verse. This tells us that, like, when we're under pressure and when we're being attacked, it's really important to navigate these challenges with integrity. When we navigate with integrity, we act wisely and we gain like credibility in the process. And that credibility, at least for Saul, struck fear into Saul. And we see this again at the end of the chapter, this idea, right? At the end of chapter 18, where it says, and Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. The princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was whenever they went out that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed, right? It's really easy when we are attacked and under pressure. It is really easy to, take cheap shots back, right? To slack on our work because we're upset about how we're being treated, right? To say, forget it. If I'm not appreciated, then I'm not going to work as hard, right? Well, that's not the situation. David was unappreciated and he was humiliated and he was attacked, but he worked twice as hard, right? And working twice as hard and living with integrity gave him, as it says in these verses, it brought him to a point where he was highly esteemed. He was gaining the hearts of people, right? And so it's important that we don't attack back, we maintain composure, and we trust that God will avenge us when needed and when appropriate, but we leave that up for God to decide. And then lastly, we work hard. We don't slack off when we're underappreciated. We continue to do our work, and we do it, as scripture says, we do it heartily as unto the Lord. This is what we need to do. When we look at David, this is how we learn from David. I know I'm kind of going fast, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute and share. So bring that up. But as we kind of close off chapter 18, we're going to go to chapter 19. And in 19, we see a little bit more of the relationship between David and Jonathan come to the surface, right? So it was highlighted in the beginning of 18, but now we're going to see a bit of the qualities of this relationship. And as things intensified for David with respect to the persecution that Saul was heaping at him, right? David realized he needed a friend to navigate the situation. It was getting hard for David to perform his duties as the captain of the army, right? Because the tension between him and Saul continued to rise. And as that tension rose, he realized, like, okay, I need help. And so he relied on his friend, Jonathan. And when we look at 1 Samuel 19, we'll look at verses 4 through 6, right? Which give us a little bit of what's happening between David and Jonathan. And in 19, what happens at the very beginning is that, Jonathan gives a warning to David, right? To say, like, careful, lay low, like, let me go and speak to my father, because my father's not going to do anything big unless I know. All right. And so Jonathan begins to intercede on David's behalf. And he intercedes in verses 4 through 6. And he says, thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father. And he said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good towards you. For he took his life into his hands and killed the Philistine. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then do you sin against the innocent blood to kill David without a cause? So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Right? So when we look at these verses and we focus our attention on the relationship, the friendship between Jonathan and David, right? Jonathan manifests his care and love for David in the sacrifices he's willing to make, right? When someone sacrifices for us in our time of need, it shows us a level of commitment that they have to the friendship that we have, right? And sacrifice is always like a measure of worth. If we don't sacrifice anything, the relationship is never worth anything, right? And there's probably been times in our lives where we are in a tough situation where we feel like the world is kind of caving in and things aren't going well and we just need help. And we probably have certain people or individuals or friends who we would envision or hope that they would step in, right? That they would all of a sudden, be a voice and a presence in our lives, right? And they don't. And we've been alarmed in these situations where who stands by us and who doesn't stand by us, who's present in my time of need, what friends are around me, and what friends who, even if I ask a small thing, it's just like they're too busy to help out, right? And so it always reminds us, like when we look at this, that friendship and good friendship, like quality friendship, meaningful friendship, is always associated with sacrifice, right? And just like we need somebody to sacrifice of their time, of their energy, of their capacity in order to help us, we too need to realize that for me to be a good friend to somebody else, it's going to demand a bit of sacrifice. I'm going to have to give up something in order to show, show support, be present, to, like what Jonathan did, speak up on the behalf of somebody, on behalf of a friend. It's going to take sacrifice. We're all going to have to sacrifice. We need somebody to sacrifice for us, and we need to sacrifice for our friends. And without that, it just can't be a good, meaningful friendship. And if we're wondering why too often, like if it seems like too often we're left alone and we're in times of need and we can't find friends, we have to kind of do some backtracking and say, like, well, have I sacrificed for my friends before expecting them to sacrifice for me? Right? It's always an important question to ask ourselves. And we need to, because none of us can navigate this life alone. We all need friends. We all need the help of others, right? So with that said, I'm gonna kind of summarize it. If anybody's got any comments, like, please feel free. But I want to kind of summarize some of the events that happened in chapter 19, and then we'll kind of close off with chapter 20, right? When we look at 19, we see how David is distraught about how Saul is pursuing him. Jonathan speaks up on his behalf, kind of speaks a bit of reason into the situation, and then Saul calms down. But we know with Saul, like, he's very labile in his emotions, and with just the tip of the hat, he can resort back to wanting to pursue David. And it's not long until Saul, peace with David, runs out, and again the distressing spirit comes. David is playing for him, a scene we've seen time and again, and he launches a spear at him, is unable to pin him down, and David runs. But this time David takes his running a bit more serious, right? Where he runs to his wife to say, like, what's going on? I don't know why your dad is after me. And between Michal and David, they come up with this plan where she's trying to protect him, and in protecting him, Saul sends his servants to go to his house and kill him, and Michal says, "Well, you can't come in. He's sick, right? He's sick. Leave him alone." And she had let David out of the window, and in the bed put some sort of dummy figure underneath the bed, and then a sheepskin over the head to make it seem like a real person was laying in the bed. And she fooled a set of guards, and eventually Saul catches on, and he gets upset, and he comes, and he wants to kill David himself, and he realizes that Michal has been helping, and she helped him escape. And Saul's not so happy with that one, and so he responds to Michal, and he says, "Why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemies away, so that he has escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, and he said to me, "Let me go. Why should I kill?" Right? So she's not being forthcoming about the truth of the situation, though she's trying to help David out, right? And so David escapes from Jerusalem, and he runs to Samuel the prophet, and so he runs to Samuel, which is in Ramah, and as he meets Samuel, he tells Samuel like what's going on in Jerusalem, all these things that Saul is doing, and they both go to a town within Ramah, which is an area called Naoth, right? And then at the very end of 19, we get this very, very interesting scene, right? Where Saul pursues after David. He knows that he's run to Samuel, and so he sends 3 groups of servants to Ramah to really approach Samuel to say, like, where's David? And Samuel is kind of overseeing, if you will, a group of prophets who are prophesying. And as the servants come, something like they're infused with the Spirit, and they too begin prophesying, and they don't come back. And then Saul sends another group of servants, another group of messengers, and they end up being infused with the Spirit, and they start prophesying. And then another group, and the same thing. And then eventually Saul himself comes, and he begins prophesying. And all this like happens with resulting in kind of it halts this search for David, which is a bit unique, right? It's kind of a different situation. And I thought I had a nice quote about this from Origen, because I was trying to, even myself, kind of look at this situation and be like, okay, what's happening? Like, how do we reconcile this situation? And I'm going to have to paraphrase this quote from Origen, where he was saying that it's not that we believe that all of a sudden like the servants of Saul and Saul himself became holy, right, and started prophesying, but they received this ability to prophesy because it was it was bestowed on them because of the situation, right? And God was helping David run and protect himself and put some space. And so it almost seems like this was a bit of a diversion, if you will, where they were prophesying because it was beneficial to the situation. It was beneficial in orchestrating the will of God, right? And we see this too with respect to, and Origen points this out, where he talks about Caiaphas. And what we gather in the gospel account is that Caiaphas, the high priest, and was against Christ, was prophesying that he would suffer, right? And so when we look at Caiaphas, Saul, and Saul's servants, we can kind of put them in the same boat and realize that even though their hearts were turned from God, that God is not beyond being able to use this situation in order to help or orchestrate his will, in order to get what needs to be done, right? And so that's one of the ways that we can look at this this scene with the different prophets or the different groups who come and all of a sudden prophesy, and Saul prophesying and all that. So I encourage you to go through and read it and just kind of get a sense of what's going on. I don't want to spend too much more time on it because I do want to look at chapter 20 and 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 really kind of put this last picture of the relationship between David and Jonathan, because it really, they take their relationship to another level in chapter 20. But I am going to pause and say, are there any questions so far or any thoughts?
I thought it was interesting that the a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, that goes back to what you were just saying about God creating all of this, because clearly that had to happen for the rest of this to go on.
Yeah, it is, and that distressing spirit is always it's always interesting, and I think there's different ways that people have approached it, where there is physically a distressing spirit that is coming, but also another way that has been looked at is that it's the absence of the presence of God, right? And whenever God is absent from our lives, there it kind of opens up the door um, for a lot of anxiety and insecurity and just restlessness, because God is peace, right? God brings clarity. And when we reject him and he pulls away as a result of that rejection, then we are left without his peace and comfort and his clarity, right? And so it it's just another way to kind of look at those verses, because the kind of the caveat, so to speak, is that if we do look at it as like God is sending a distressing, you know, spirit, then you wonder, like, is there an evilness to God where he is intentionally like causing distress to somebody, and that kind of runs us into this conundrum of like, what when we say that God is absolute goodness, like then what comes out of him is good, right? And so kind of with that understanding, that's why one of the ways to look at it is to say God's presence was removed from Saul, just like he said, when Saul messed up with the sacrifice, and Samuel said, just as you ripped my cloth away from me, the Lord has ripped the kingdom away from you. And he withdrew his spirit from Saul, right? So whenever there's that withdrawal from it, whenever God withdraws from us as a result of our rejection of him, right, then we tend to get that distressing spirit. And it's always interesting because when we look at David, who has a very clear presence of God in his life, it's that presence of God that brings comfort to Saul. But it's almost like foreign because Saul has rejected God. So we see that theme kind of coming up time and time again. Saul's distress, absence of God. David is a source of peace, presence of God. But yeah, it's sometimes I can be honest, like sometimes looking at these different scenarios and these situations, it can be a little bit tough, and so we need to challenge ourselves to look at it from multiple angles. All right, let's go on to chapter 20, and where we're going to see a different level to the relationship of David and Jonathan, right? And chapter 20, really brings in this idea of sacrifice, but it looks at it with respect to loyalty, right? And the question for us to kind of tease out is kind of what's the difference between loyalty and sacrifice. We saw in chapter 19 that Jonathan is sacrificing, and taking some risks for David. But in chapter 20, we see loyalty, right? And And so that's what I want us to focus on in the next, 5 to 7 minutes as we wrap up chapter 20. And I started off, oh, there's the quote I was looking for. All right. Here we go. All right, so chapter 20. Then David fled from Naioth and Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" So David is clearly confused and distraught. So Jonathan said to him, "By no means you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Then David took an oath again and said, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death.' So Jonathan said to David, 'Whatever yourself desires, I will do for you." Right? So David's distraught. He runs to Jonathan. He's not sure what to do. And Jonathan says, like, "Okay, how can I help you? Whatever you need, I'm going to help." Right? And so David makes a request. And the request is that there's a feast of the new moon, and it lasts 3 days. And David's going to be expected to be at the feast. And David is afraid to go to the feast because if he goes, like, Saul is a hothead. He doesn't want any more spears, thrown at him. So he's like, "Help me get out of the feast." And so Jonathan says, "Okay, go to, I'll tell King Saul that you had to go to Bethlehem for a yearly sacrifice, and your older brother is really commanding you to come back and to do this yearly sacrifice with the family, right? And that'll be your excuse." And so they come up with this plan that, depending on how Saul reacts to David's absence and Jonathan's explanation for his absence, Jonathan is going to relay that information to David through this scene of shooting arrows. And if the arrows are to the right of the target, it's okay for David to come back. But if he shoots the arrows past the target, then it's not safe for David, and David has to leave, right? So that's kind of how they're going to communicate, since David really can't come close to the palace. And so the feast happens. David's not there. First day, Saul's kind of saying, "Okay, there's got to be an excuse." Second day, he's upset that David isn't there, and he's asking, "Why isn't this? And where's David?" And Jonathan says, "Well, he had to go back to a family feast." And Saul is extremely upset, and he does not buy it, right? And this is Saul's response to Jonathan. He says, "Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, 'You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now, therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die.' And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and he said to him, 'Why should he be killed? What has he done?' Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. And so Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully." Right? So at the beginning, I was saying what we want to piece out is, what's the difference, or kind of, I don't know if there's a difference, but maybe, like, how do we differentiate kind of sacrifice for a friend and loyalty to a friend, right? Because I think David and Jonathan's relationship, especially from the point of view of Jonathan shows loyalty. Yes, he has sacrificed, but the scene that we have unraveled before us shows a great deal of loyalty, which, if you will, like, loyalty is such a much higher level of sacrifice, because loyalty sees no end to the sacrifice that can be made, even up until death. Right? When we sacrifice for our friends, and we think of times where we feel that we have sacrificed, quite a bit, we can always draw a limit to that, right? And that limit to it is going to be governed by a loyalty that we have towards something else or someone else, right? So we can sacrifice for a family member or for a friend, but when it really starts to impinge on our family or even our finances sometimes, we can say, okay, I've sacrificed enough. But loyalty sees no end to the sacrifice that can be made. And that's what we see in Jonathan right now. Jonathan sees no end to what he can give up for David, right? He sees David as the anointed one. He sees his father Saul as crazy and unreasonable. And he's willing to give up his seat to the throne because he believes that David should be on the throne. And he's willing to give up his life for this. That's loyalty, right? Loyalty sees no end to the sacrifice that can be made, right? And just like in our marriages, like there's no end to the sacrifices we can make for our spouses. There's no end to the sacrifices we can make for our children, and so on. And when we look at the saints, their loyalty to the message gospel led them to martyrdom. So loyalty always takes sacrifice, but it sees no end to the sacrifice that can be made. And that's what we see in David and Jonathan in this relationship, which makes it so special, right? And so Jonathan gives David the message. They have an embrace as their final goodbye. And then David really goes on the run because Saul is about to really pursue hard after him. And that's going to be an upcoming discussion. Any thoughts or questions?
I had just two thoughts, if I
Yes.
might. I was thinking along this process also that Jonathan was the son of a king and demonstrated a great deal of humility in his relationship with David. But I think he recognized that David fundamentally was greater than he was,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's where that humility comes in, that this is a person who, is far better than I am. I'm going to devote myself to him, and that's why he was able to stand up to his father.
Yeah.
He realized somebody greater was there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And not only was he heir, he was older than David, more experienced than David, and he showed a great deal of humility. Yeah. Was there another point? I thought you said two, or just that?
Just that there he was humbled because he realized that the man in front of him was a greater man than he was.
Yeah. Really nice point. Thank you.